Yeah. I go 6. Okay. Not given this before. So.
Yeah, disagree. Yeah, I mentioned go through the station. Everyone's working.
Let's be talking. 6 mates.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another installment of our lecture series here in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at the University of Recalcitrant. Today, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Adam Bradley, who is an assistant professor of philosophy and a fellow at the Hong Kong Catastrophic Risk Center at Lingnan University. He works primarily in the philosophy of mind and psychiatry and artificial intelligence. He's written on topics such as the nature of bodily pain, rationality, delusional belief, welfare in AI systems. He's published many of his thoughts in excellent journals such as House, Philosophical Quarterly, Philosophy and Phenomenological Research, the Australasian Journal of Philosophy, the Journal of Analytic Philosophy, and so on. More, I assure you. Today, Professor Bradley is here to give us a talk by the title Recalcitrance, Rationality, and the Nature of Emotion. You know what I'm about to ask you next. Before we pass things along to Professor Bradley, please give a round of applause for our visiting speaker.
Oh, thanks, Ben, for the very warm introduction. Thank you, everyone, for attending. So yeah, the title of my talk today is Recalcitrance, Rationality, and the Nature of Emotion, and I'll explain some of these terms as we go along. So I'm going to start off with quote. This is a passage from Dante's Inferno, in particular a certain translation of it. So that the quote says, "We dread an object when, but only when, that object has the power to do some harm. Nothing can otherwise occasion fear." So this claim, if you think about it, is plainly wrong. Because what this claim is saying is it's impossible to fear something unless that thing is in fact dangerous. But of course, that's not true. A fake gun could make you just as scared as a real gun. A gun isn't dangerous. And so I've spoken to a native Italian speaker about this. This is a mistranslation. Dante is not making this philosophical mistake, but it's a useful illustration that you can go wrong in thinking about the sort of objects or targets of the emotions. But my target in this talk, my topic, is a slightly different phenomenon. It's not only the case that we can fear things that are not in fact dangerous, it's also the case that we can fear things that we know are not dangerous. So what's an example? Well, this is an example of what's called in the literature recalcitrant fear, more broadly recalcitrant emotions. So I'm not only going to talk about fear, I'm going to talk about emotions more generally, but I'm going to use fear as an example. So an example of a recalcitrant fear, and I'll say what that means in a second, is the case of Spiros. Just imagine this guy. He's deeply afraid of dogs, and his fear of dogs is so great that it extends not just to dangerous dogs like Rottweilers or Pit Bulls, but perfectly safe and harmless dogs like his friend Agnes's elderly and good-natured golden retriever Moby. So Moby's not dangerous at all. Nevertheless, Spiros in Moby's presence, feels very afraid. So Spiros knows that Moby is harmless, but he feels afraid nonetheless. And so because Spiros's fear persists despite Spiros's own judgment, and this is important, Spiros himself knows that the dog is harmless. Because Spiros's fear persists despite his own judgment that rationally conflicts with it, that this dog is not dangerous, it's harmless, it's an example of what Darms and Jacobson call a recalcitrant emotion. So a recalcitrant emotion is just an emotion that persists in spite of a judgment that rationally conflicts with. So an emotion is recalcitrant when it persists despite the subject judging that the emotion is unfitting in light of reasons that they possess. So Spiros isn't confused about how dangerous Moby is. It's very clear. Moby's not dangerous. Moby's a very good-natured and safe dog, but he's still afraid of him. So that's a recalcitrant fear. There are many examples of recalcitrant emotions. Fear of flying, despite knowing that it's statistically safe. Guilt about an accident that you were involved in, despite the fact that the accident was not your fault. Normally, guilt is an appropriate response to something that you've done. But if it was an accident and you didn't do it, it doesn't, in that sense, make sense for you to feel guilt. Nevertheless, it's very common for people to feel guilt, even about things they had not, they bear no responsibility for. You might have a dream in which your partner does something that wrongs you, and so in the dream you're angry at your partner, and you wake up and you feel kind of annoyed at your partner. Yeah, you ask why, and you realize it's because you had this dream, but still your anger, your resentment might last, even though you realize it's completely inappropriate to be angry at someone for something that you dreamed that they did that they didn't actually do. Right? So these are all examples of recalcitrant emotions. Right? They're cases where the subject knows, or at least reasonably believes, that the emotion is inappropriate, yet it persists. Okay, so why do recalcitrant emotions matter? Why are they philosophically interesting? Well, in addition to being, I think, just kind of interesting for their own sake, philosophers of emotion have spent a lot of time talking about recalcitrant emotions because they raise two important and related questions. First, what I call rational conflict, which is the question, in what sense do recalcitrant emotions involve genuine irrationality? What is, if anything, irrational about recalcitrant emotions? So many people, in describing, hearing situations like the ones I've described, think there's something less than ideally or fully rational about a subject who is afraid of something that he knows isn't harmless or isn't dangerous. And this question about rational conflict raises a sort of even more basic or fundamental question about rational status. Are emotions even the sort of state that reasons bear on? So our beliefs are a paradigmatic example of a rational state of mind, in the sense of a state of mind that's sensitive to reasons in the form of evidence, that the belief that P is sensitive to evidence for and against the truth of P. And so there's a question, are emotions rational in the same sort of way that beliefs are? Get to this in a second. And so answering these questions, or the answer to these questions, of course, depends on what emotions actually are. And so different theories of the emotions, different accounts philosophers have developed about the nature of emotional states like fear and anger, give us different answers to question of rational conflict and the question of rational states. Okay, so with that set up, I'm now going to describe some of the major leading views in the philosophy of emotion and talk about how or whether these views can explain or account for the phenomenon of emotional recalcitrance. So emotional recalcitrance here is going to be a kind of test case for theories of emotion. Can they explain? So perhaps, at least historically, or in recent history, the leading theory of emotions in the kind of broadly analytic tradition is cognitivism, or sometimes called judgmentalism, where a cognitivist theory of emotions holds that emotions are, or at least contain as an essential element, evaluative judgments or beliefs. So the sort of very simple, maximally reductive version of cognitivism would hold that what it is to be afraid of the dog just is to believe that the dog is dangerous. Of course, you can have more complicated views where an emotion involves the belief that the dog is dangerous, but maybe something else. So, for example, some people hold that fear involves, or fear or other emotions involve an evaluative belief, but also an imaginative episode. So maybe it's the judgment that the dog is dangerous plus like imagining the dog attacking you or something like that. But anyway, that broad heading characterizes a number of different cognitivist views. What they have in common is that they treat emotions as a kind of belief or belief-like phenomenon. And so if we think back to the problem or puzzle of emotional recalcitrance and these claims of rational conflict and rational status, cognitivism gives a straightforward answer to both of those questions. Right? Remember, the question we're interested in is, are emotions rational states of mind? And if so, in virtue of what do they rationally conflict with beliefs? Well, if fear involves the judgment that, say, X is dangerous, but you simultaneously judge that X is harmless, so Spiros fears the dog, but judges that the dog is not dangerous, then the subject just holds contradictory beliefs. And holding contradictory beliefs is a paradigmatically irrational state of mind. It's the paradigmatically irrational state of mind. And so, because beliefs have rational status and beliefs can rationally conflict with one another, cognitivism seems to answer both of our target questions. The problem is, it seems to give in some way the wrong answer to at least one of these evaluative questions. In that, in cases of emotional recalcitrance, it just doesn't seem true that the subject literally holds contradictory beliefs. So maybe that happens sometimes. Maybe sometimes people literally hold contradictory beliefs. A commonly cited framework for seeing how that's possible is maybe our set of beliefs is somehow fragmented. Like maybe, I've only been to Macau a couple times, and so I might have an incoherent sort of mental map of Macau. I think that university is in one place in sort of one part of my belief system, and I think that the university is in a different place in another part of my belief system. And so though I don't realize it, my beliefs contradict. My beliefs about the location of the university are tacitly contradictory. That sort of thing can happen. But in cases like the example of Spiros, we're not talking about different beliefs, in sort of different parts of the subject's mind. Spiros, at the very same moment, is afraid of the dog and knows that the dog is harmless. So it's quite doubtful that Spiros literally holds contradictory judgments about how dangerous Moby is. If you ask him, he's not of two minds about Moby's dangerousness. He'll just say, the dog is harmless. The problem is he's still afraid of it. Right? And so attributing some kind of unconscious contrary judgment violates, there are different ways of putting the objection, but one is it violates the principle of charity. So there's this general idea that in trying to understand another person, you should try to make as much sense of their state of mind as possible. You should treat them as rational insofar as you can. And attributing literally contradictory judgments to a subject, the belief that P and the belief that not P at the same time, in the same thought, in the same frame of mind, would just make them out to be completely incoherent. And so in this way, or for this reason, many people think cognitivism can't provide an adequate explanation of the kind of rational conflict that occurs in recalcitrant emotions, either because it predicts too much irrationality on the part of the subject or the wrong kind of irrationality. Okay, so that's a pretty standard take in the philosophy of emotions literature, a pretty standard criticism of cognitivism, right? So in fact, recalcitrant emotions, like the ones we're discussing, are standardly taken to be a kind of refutation of cognitivism for the reasons I've just given. And so another attempt to say what emotions are is perceptualism. And like cognitivism, perceptualism is a kind of big picture theory at the broadest level. Perceptualism is just the view that emotions are perception-like representations of evaluative properties. And of course, quite a lot hinges on what we mean by perception-like, but different perceptualist views give different answers to exactly the way in which emotions are like or analogous to perceptual states. The general idea is that emotions play a similar epistemic role to perceptual states in the sense of, something like providing prima facie or kind of immediate and direct justification for evaluative judgments. So a typical perceptualist idea is in experiencing fear, you represent that the object of your fear is dangerous in a perception-like way, and that feeling, that experience can then immediately justify the belief that the object is dangerous. So in this theory, fear of Moby will be a perception-like state that presents Moby as dangerous. So the advantage of perceptualism when it comes to emotional recalcitrance is that it avoids the contradiction problem that faced cognitivism. It doesn't require us to say that in cases of recalcitrant emotion, subjects literally believe a contradiction. That's good. So a famous comparison here is with the visual illusions like the Muller-Lyer illusion, right? So here's the Muller-Lyer illusion, right? All of these lines are actually the exact same length, so they don't look it. So that's why it's a visual illusion. And even after I tell you all four of these lines are the exact same length, you still don't see them that way. Right? So you now know this. It is in fact true. We can get out the tape measure. I can prove it to you. But they just do not look equal. Humans who have a normally functioning visual system, this looks longer than this. That's the Muller-Lyer illusion. So the idea here is maybe Spiros's fear is a kind of emotional illusion, in the same way the Muller-Lyer is a visual illusion. And just as knowing that the lines are equal doesn't get rid of the visual illusion, knowing that Moby is harmless doesn't get rid of the emotional illusion. That's the perceptualist idea. But the problem with perceptualism is it seems to give us, as it were, too little rational conflict, or indeed no rational conflict at all. Because perceptual states just don't seem like the right sorts of states to rationally conflict with beliefs at all. So, if we go back to the Muller-Lyer illusion, once I've told you that these two line segments are the exact same length, and assume you believe me, so now you know that they're the same length, it still remains the case that they look to be different lengths. But plausibly, your visual experience now just gives you no reason to think that they're the same length. This would be even clearer if I actually got the ruler out and measured, right? Once I've shown you that these two line segments are the same length, even though your visual illusion will persist, it gives you no actual reason to think that the lines are the same length. And so there's not any sense in which this visual experience rationally conflicts with your beliefs. Right? A simple way of putting this is just experiencing the Muller-Lyer illusion does not in and of itself make you irrational. Maybe if you believe that the lines are different lengths, even after I bring out the ruler and show you that they're the same, that would be irrational. But just experiencing them as different is not irrational. Right, so more broadly, just perceptual states don't seem to be the kinds of states that merit rational evaluation at all, precisely because they're not subject to revision in the light of our reasons. So if perceptualism were true, recalcitrant emotions would not be genuinely irrational, they would merely be in some way inaccurate. In the same way, my visual perception of these lines is not irrational, it's just in some way inaccurate. Okay. And so summarizing a lot of the recent literature on the emotions, a lot of philosophers have tried to develop sort of middle positions, or positions where they say emotions are states that are, quasi-beliefs or like beliefs, but not quite full beliefs, or emotions are like perceptual states, but not quite perceptual states. Emotions occupy some kind of middle position between perception and cognition to try to navigate this kind of dilemma. This is what Grzankowski calls the Goldilocks problem. But as Grzankowski, I think, very convincingly argues in a 2020 paper called Navigating Recalcitrant Emotions, no one has yet been able to make out any kind of stable middle ground position. And in fact, it doesn't seem like it's possible to do so. What he means is any attitude short of judgment seems like it's not going to be judgment-like enough to generate real rational conflict between the emotion and the judgment. Spiro's fear of the dog and his belief that the dog is harmless. But building in a judgment to the emotion itself seems to generate too much or the wrong kind of rational conflict. So, for example, even though recalcitrant emotions strike us as irrational, they don't strike us as unintelligible. Whereas if someone came along and said, I believe that the dog is dangerous and I believe that the dog is not dangerous, we wouldn't even know what they were talking about. Right? That's literally an incoherent assertion. Whereas, even though we want to say Spiros is irrational, we all understand what state of mind he's in. He's afraid of the dog, but he believes that the dog isn't dangerous. And so the difficulty here is what Sabrine Doring calls finding conflict without contradiction, explaining the way that an emotion and a belief can rationally conflict with one another without making them literally contradictory beliefs or judgments. Okay. So that's a kind of brief history of the debate about the nature of the emotions. I now want to get into some features of emotional states that I'm going to take for granted in this talk and that are widely accepted in the literature. So the first, some of which I've been tacitly assuming already. So one feature of emotional states that I want to highlight explicitly is their intentionality. So emotions are intentional states of mind in the sense that they are of or about or directed at objects and states of affairs in the world. So Spiros's fear is directed at Moby. Moby is therefore the intentional object of the attitude. Moby is that which the fear is directed towards. And emotions don't have to literally be directed at objects. Of course, Moby is an object, a thing. But emotions can also be directed at states of affairs. So you can be angry that you were fired from your job. Being fired from your job, sort of metaphysically speaking, isn't an object, it's a state of affairs. But of course, it can also be the target of your anger. So all emotions, at least I'm going to assume, take an intentional object in this sense. In addition, emotions have another intentional aspect. So emotions do not just present their objects, as it were, blankly or neutrally. As has long been recognized, this goes back at least to Anthony Kinney, each emotion type, so fear, anger, joy, sadness, etc., is associated with a distinctive, what I'm going to call an evaluative feature, what Kinney calls a formal object. So the evaluative feature associated with fear is dangerousness or fearsomeness, something like that. The evaluative feature associated with anger is, offensiveness or, harmfulness to me, something like that. The evaluative feature associated with joy is something like beneficialness to me. You could dispute exactly what the relevant evaluative feature is. I'm being a little loose here, but we're going to work with these examples for the sake of argument. Just the general idea here is, in having a given emotion, your emotion says something about its target, about its intentional object. It says that the target is good or bad, harmful, dangerous, so on and so forth. So I'm going to call those evaluative features. A further feature of emotions that I want to highlight is that they are what philosophers call fitting attitudes. So what this means is an emotion is the kind of state of mind that is in some way fitting or correct or appropriate depending on the circumstances in the world. So an emotion is fitting if and only if its intentional object possesses the relevant evaluative feature. So in the example we've been working with, Spiros's fear of Moby is unfitting because Moby is not dangerous, while Lou's anger at being fired is fitting because being fired is offensive in the sense of being harmful or detrimental to one's interests. And fittingness in this sense is objective. So a subject can have mistaken beliefs about the fittingness of their emotions. So an emotion is fitting if the target actually has the relevant evaluative feature, and that's not the same thing as someone thinking that it has the relevant evaluative feature. So fittingness comes apart from a subject's thinking or feeling that their emotion is fitting. Another feature of emotions that I want to highlight is what I've been calling their rational status. So emotions are the kinds of states that reason bear on. At least that's something I've taken for granted. Not everyone agrees with this, but I think that the way that we respond to cases of emotional recalcitrance suggests that this is true. Another way of putting this, adopting some language of Ronnie D'Souza's, is that kind of Aristotelian language. Emotions seem to be categorially rational states of mind, where that means that emotions are like beliefs in being the kinds of states for which the question of rationality arises. So they fall into the category of the rational. Whereas, a rock or a desk is not categorically rational in this sense. It's not even the kind of thing for which the question of rationality can arise. And so emotions seem to be categorically rational in this sense because being fired seems to give you a reason to be angry. So if you show up, you're obviously angry and ask you why. You say, I just got fired from my job. That explanation makes perfect sense. Your anger is now rationalized, right, from my perspective. It makes sense to me because being fired strikes us as a good or at least appropriate reason to feel angry, maybe depending on the circumstances. And so our practices of emotional regulation, broadly speaking, people's practices of emotional regulation presuppose this. We sometimes criticize people for emotions that are unwarranted in light of the available reasons. Like being angry at someone who hasn't really harmed you seems inappropriate to us. So we can now say a recalcitrant emotion is one that persists despite the subject judging in light of the reasons that it's unfitting. Just kind of a restatement of what we had earlier. And so Spiros judges that Moby is not dangerous. And so he himself judges that his fear is unfitting. Now maybe Spiros wouldn't use the term unfitting, because maybe Spiros isn't a philosopher, right? Fittingness is kind of a philosophical term. But the point is, Spiros, who's just a normal person, would recognize that there's some sense in which his fear is inappropriate, mistaken, once he's realized that the dog is afraid of is completely harmless. And indeed, Spiros himself would experience some kind of inner rational conflict. He himself would realize that he is in some sense endorsing and rejecting at the same time something about the dog's dangerousness, right? So ordinary people, not just philosophers, of course, have some understanding or basic appreciation of the fact that fear is an appropriate response to dangerous things rather than funny things, right? Anyone who has the concept of fear knows facts like that. And so Spiros himself will be able to recognize that it is in some sense inappropriate, unfitting, incorrect to be afraid of something that is perfectly harmless. Okay, so all that's kind of set up for the question that I really want to answer in this talk, which is, how is this possible? How is it possible for a subject to be in this situation, given what I've argued previously, that emotions and judgments are fundamentally different kinds of states? Right? In other words, if we reject cognitivism, as I think we should, we now have this puzzle. We've agreed that emotions aren't beliefs, but we think that they rationally conflict with beliefs. How is this possible? Okay. So before I give my answer, I want to talk a little bit about another answer to this question that I think is not necessarily wrong, but ultimately unsatisfying. So this is the answer to the question of, what, in virtue of what are recalcitrant emotions irrational, given by Alex Grzankowski in this paper that I've referenced. And so what Grzankowski does in this paper is develop what I'm going to call a formal account of the irrationality of recalcitrant emotions. And I call it a formal account because it appeals, as we'll see, to what philosophers call a structural rational principle to explain the irrationality of recalcitrant emotions, rather than any substantive theory of what emotions are. Right, so Grzankowski looked at, cognitivism and perceptualism. Those are substantive theories of what emotions are, said they can't explain emotional recalcitrance. His approach is, I'm not even going to try to give a substantive theory of what emotions are. I'm just going to say this principle that he calls misfit is true. This principle holds. And the reason why a subject like Spiros is irrational is because he violates this principle. So the principle Grzankowski invokes is what he calls misfit. And misfit says, there's some jargon in here, but I'll explain it all. Misfit says, if one is in an emotional state about some object O, governed by some norm N, and one simultaneously judges in a way that predicates the negation of the property analog of N to O, then necessarily one will violate a norm. So there's a lot of jargon there, but really the principle is quite simple. What Grzankowski is saying here is belief is governed by what we can call the truth norm. Believe only true things. So belief fits the truth. If you believe that P and P is true, your belief is correct. If you believe that P and P is false, your belief is incorrect. So the norm governing truth is the truth. Belief is the truth norm. And each emotion, like fear, will be associated with its own norm. Let's say fear is associated with the danger norm. fear only that which is dangerous. So a fear will be correct, just in case the thing feared is dangerous, and a fear will be incorrect otherwise. And so all misfit is saying is if a subject at the same time judges that the dog is not dangerous and fears the dog, then they're going to violate at least one norm, the truth norm or the danger norm. Because either the dog is dangerous or it isn't. If it is dangerous, then their belief violates the truth norm. And if it isn't dangerous, then their fear violates the danger norm. And so that's why they're irrational, because they're violating at least one rational norm, truth or danger. All right, so this example, fear is governed by fittingness tied to dangerousness. You fear Moby and judge Moby not dangerous necessarily. Either your fear is fitting or your judgment is false, but either way, you're making a normative mistake. It's a mistake to believe the false, and it's a mistake to fear the harmful. So this abstract principle, misfit, this is Grzankowski's explanation of why recalcitrant emotions are irrational. They're irrational because in having one, you violate this principle. And crucially, this explanation works without requiring that emotions share logically contradictory contents. So in his paper, he talks about the quest to find a Goldilocks attitude, an attitude somehow logically weaker than judgment, but logically stronger than perception that could generate the sort of right kind of or right amount of rational conflict. But this story doesn't involve finding some magical special attitude to identify emotions with. He just says this principle's true, and subjects having recalcitrant emotions violate it, or more strictly, they violate one of the norms implicated in it, and that's why they're irrational. Okay. So misfit tells us that there's a guaranteed norm violation in cases of recalcitrant emotion. In other words, a subject like Spiros necessarily is doing something wrong. They're either believing something that's false or fearing something that's harmless. And each one violates a rational norm. Believe the true, fear the dangerous. But nothing, and this is my fundamental criticism of Grzankowski, nothing in his story tells us why this is going on. Right, so the deeper question here is what I somewhat grandiosely call the grounding question, and it's a kind of presuppositional question about Grzankowski's story. And the question is, what is it about emotional states that makes them apt for rational conflict with beliefs in the first place? Right, so Grzankowski comes along and invokes this principle, misfit. He says, this is true, so subjects experiencing emotional recalcitrance violate a norm. But there's a more general, I think more fundamental question, which is, what are emotions such that they generate rational norms in the first place? Right? Answering this question, right, what is it about emotional states that makes them apt for rational conflict or gives them rational status at all? That seems to require saying what it is for a mental state to have rational status, and that in turn seems to require giving a substantive account of what the emotions are. Right? So in effect, Grzankowski's solution to the problem, I think, presupposes the very thing that's in question, which is answering or addressing this how possible question of how emotional states of mind are even the right kind of thing for rational norms to apply to them. And this principle misfit just doesn't say anything about that. It presupposes that. And so what I want to do is to try to address what I hear called the grounding question, to say, in effect, what emotions are such that they're the kind of state for which questions of rationality and reasonableness even arise. So My criticism of Grzankowski isn't strictly speaking that this principle's false. In fact, I don't think it is false. I think it is true. In cases of recalcitrance, one violates one of those two norms. It's rather to say this is on its own not a sufficient answer to the puzzle of recalcitrant emotions, because at its core the puzzle is what even are emotions such that they can be rational or irrational, rational and conflict with beliefs. Okay. So that's kind of the setup, and now I want to start giving my answer. So the first question to get clear on here is, well, what is it for a state to have rational status in the first place? What is it for a state of mind, any state of mind, to be the kind of state that reasons bear on? So as we've seen, emotions at least seem to have rational status. I mean, some philosophers argue that they don't. I'm not going to say too much about that kind of skepticism here. I'm just going to kind of go with what I think our ordinary practices are, which seem to presume that, being fired from your job does, or at least can, give you a reason to be angry. Seems true. So our practices of emotional regulation presuppose this. But why do emotions have rational status? Or more particularly, what grounds this? What explains it? What is it about emotions, given the kinds of mental states that they are, that explains how they're even the kind of state that reasons can bear on? And the answer can't just be that some formal principle like misfit says that they're rational states of mind, or implies that they're rational states of mind. There has to be some positive answer, positive account of what the emotions are, and that's something Grzankowski doesn't give. So we need to know what feature emotions have that might make a principle like misfit true. First. Okay. And so my answer to this, my answer to this question of what feature emotions must possess in order to count as rational, in order to have rational status, is in a way not very surprising. This is just sort of the off-the-shelf kind of answer you're going to get if you start wading into the sort of reasons and rationality literature. There's a widely, not universally, but widely held idea in the reasons and rationality literature that rationality is fundamentally a matter of responsiveness to reasons, where a reason here can be understood more or less as a fact. So, for example, the fact that it's raining outside gives me a reason to carry an umbrella. So, not assuming any particular metaphysical picture of what reasons are, just sort of using reason talk in a very plain way. The fact that it's raining outside gives me a reason to carry an umbrella. So you can just take reasons to be facts for sake of this argument. And crucially, one can reason into or out of a belief, say the belief that P, in particular, depending on what one's evidence suggests. So, insofar as you gain evidence supporting the truth of P, your belief, your belief, you develop a belief that P, or your belief that P, somehow strengthens, because your belief that P seems somehow responsive to that evidence, responsive to those reasons. Likewise, if you get evidence that P is false, your belief that P might go away, or its strength might somehow be diminished. And again, that seems to be because the belief that P is responsive to reasons in the form of evidence, right? Evidence being the kinds of reasons that bear on beliefs. But crucially, and again, I think uncontroversially, not all states of mind are responsive to reasons in this way. So lightheadedness, for example, is a kind of state of mind, right? You can feel lightheaded, if you haven't eaten enough calories, your blood sugar is too low, you feel lightheaded. That's a conscious state of mind, but it's not responsive to reasons. If you're feeling lightheaded, you can't get out of it by telling yourself, see, I'm on a diet now, and so I have a good reason not to eat today. So let's stop feeling lightheaded. You can tell yourself that, but it's not going to work. Lightheadedness is a state of mind that you're in. It's determined by your blood sugar level. It's not determined by your reasons, your perspective on your reasons. So not all states of mind are reasons responsive. Same thing with visual experiences. If you open your eyes and look at the screen, you have an experience of the screen. No matter what you tell yourself about the reasons you have for and against seeing the screen, it's not going to make any difference. As long as your eyes are open and working properly, you're going to see the screen. So again, the idea here, not totally uncontroversial, but still I think very plausible. Rational states of mind like beliefs are reasons responsive. Non-rational states of mind like lightheadedness are not. And emotions pattern with beliefs in being reasons responsive. Just to say a little bit more about what I mean by formal versus substantive rational principles, since this terminology might not be familiar to everyone. So-called formal or structural rational requirements concern relations between attitudes in a way that abstracts away from the contents. So an example of a so-called formal or structural rational requirement would be what I'm calling non-contradiction. Non-contradiction is a rational or putative rational requirement that says don't believe contradictions. Don't be such as to believe P and not P simultaneously. And it's formal because P here is a variable. It doesn't have any particular content. It doesn't matter what P is. You should just never believe contradictions. These sorts of formal or structural rational requirements differ from so-called substantive rational requirements. So a substantive rational requirement crucially depends on the actual content of one's evidence. So, for example, consider the putative substantive rational principle that I'm calling evidence, which says, believe P to the extent that you have evidence for it, or something like that. Believe P only if your evidence supports it, something like that. Crucially, whether you should believe P is going to depend on what your actual evidence is. Right? And of course, the content of P. So if the content of P is it's raining outside, then this principle would say, believe it's raining outside to the extent that your evidence confirms that it's raining outside. Right? So these structural requirements bring in facts about your actual evidence, actual content about the way that the world is. They're not just merely formal principles like non-contradiction. And so in this terminology, misfit is a formal principle. It just says, don't be such as to simultaneously have the belief that P and the belief that P is not, or X is not F, and the fear that X is F, or the emotion that X is F. Something like that. So in that way, it's quite like non-contradiction. Right? But what we need is a substantive account of emotional states, one that identifies what feature of emotions actually makes them fit for rational assessment. And so here's what I put forward as a substantive answer to this question of rational status. I submit that, not that this is new to me, there's lots of work on reasons responsiveness. I cite a little bit of it here, but there's a large literature on this, but this is my version of the principle. So the principle that I'm calling reasons responsiveness says a mental state is rationally evaluable only if the processes that produce and sustain it are causally sensitive to what the subject takes to be reasons bearing on that state. So this in particular comes from this paper of Kate Nolfe's, but this sort of idea is all over the literature. The basic idea is, how can we tell whether a given mental state, an emotion, a belief, or emotions, beliefs, feelings of lightheadedness are rational or not? We consult reasons responsiveness. The rational just in case they're reasons responsive, where that means that their production, maintenance, formation is responsive to the subject's perspective on their own reasons. Basically, what the subject thinks is true. So, to use the example again, go back to belief and lightheadedness. Belief, passes this reasons responsiveness test because whether I should believe that it's raining outside is sensitive to what I take to be considerations that bear on whether it's raining outside, right? So should I believe that it's raining outside? Well, I look outside and I don't see any rain. That's a consideration that seems to obviously bear on whether it's raining outside, and so rationally influences whether I have that belief. Belief's reasons responsive. Lightheadedness doesn't pass that test. You can tell yourself whatever you want. It's not going to get rid of your lightheadedness. And so reasons responsiveness in this sense is not what people call voluntary control, right? So I have voluntary control over whether I'm going to drink water right now, but famously we don't seem to have, voluntary control over, for example, what we believe. Instead of reasons responsiveness is some kind of more direct connection or coupling between our perspective on the reasons that we have and attitudes that arise out of those reasons, governed by these psychological mechanisms. So this corresponds to what McHugh, following Fisher and Arviza, calls attitudinal control, which is revising attitudes directly for reasons in a way that's not mediated by the will. So basically, reasons responsiveness has two components, what it called reasons receptivity, which is just the capacity to recognize certain things as reasons, and reasons reactivity, which is the capacity to respond to those reasons by forming or not forming or revising the relevant attitude. Right, so headaches and lightheadedness and visual illusions fail this test of reactivity because no recognition of reasons will make a headache go away or make you stop feeling lightheaded or make the Mueller-Lyer lines look equal. What does that tell us? Both by reasons responsiveness, these mental states are not rational states of mind. And crucially, something Nolfi notes, the coupling between an attitude and one's take on the reasons that bear on it is not all or nothing. It comes in degrees. So our belief-regulating dispositions are tightly coupled. Right? Learning that evidence supports P typically produces the belief that P, but, and this is going to be crucial to when we get back to emotional recalcitrance, in the case of emotions, our dispositions to revise our emotions are less directly tied to our reasons. So there could be a greater gap between the reasons we possess and the emotions that we form. And indeed, this seems like the right result. This is why our evaluative practice is somewhat ambivalent when it comes to the emotions. We do sometimes hold people responsible for their emotions. We say that emotion of yours is irrational. But we give people much more leeway in the emotions that they have than the beliefs that they have. If someone is afraid of roller coasters, even though roller coasters aren't actually that dangerous, we don't really criticize that too much. That makes sense. Whereas if someone continues to believe that roller coasters are dangerous, despite the fact that you've given them mounds of evidence that they're perfectly safe, I just think they're being irrational. Like it's proven that they're safe. And so the idea here is, in cases of recalcitrant emotion, this coupling between a subject's perspective on their reasons for being in an attitude and the mechanism that generates that attitude or revises that attitude is present but weakened. All right, so Spiros is still reasons receptive. He recognizes that he has no reason to fear Moby. Moby's safe. But his fear-regulating dispositions are insufficiently reasons reactive. The coupling between his judgment and his emotional response is too weak to extinguish the fear. And so this distinguishes recalcitrant emotions from what you might think of as a similar, but I think is importantly different phenomenon, which you might call pure phobia, where no amount of reasoning will have any effectiveness in getting rid of the problem. So someone who has sort of a full-blown phobia will not be responsive to reasons at all. That's kind of the extreme end of the spectrum. Okay, so how does this help us? Well, reasons reactivity reasons responsiveness gives us a answer to the grounding question. It is the reasons responsiveness of emotions that makes them apt for rational status and so apt for rational conflict with beliefs. Okay. Now, the final thing I want to do in the last few minutes available. Robert, how much time do I have left? When did we start?
About 4 minutes. Fish.
Okay, well, I'll try not to go too long. Now, I've given an answer to the question of what feature of emotions grounds or generates a rational status, but I still haven't really told you what emotions are. Right? What kind of thing are emotional states of mind such that they are reasons responsive in this way? That's what I want to do here in this last section. At least give you a sketch, if not a full answer, to the question of the nature of emotional states. So this appeal to reasons responsiveness only works if our best account of emotional states coheres with them. We've already seen emotions can't be beliefs. This attempt to try to find a Goldilocks attitude has failed, right? So what are emotions such that they're reasons responsive in the right way? And so what I propose is that we look to work in psychology and affective neuroscience and work in philosophy that draws upon these sources to try to develop an idea of the kind of mental state that emotions are. So recent work in the evaluativist paradigm gives us the resources, I think, to say what emotions are and how they can be reasons responsive, albeit imperfectly so. And the basic idea here, the simple takeaway from this talk, is emotions are a distinctive type of evaluative representational state. They represent evaluative properties of their objects by integrating inputs from multiple different cognitive sources. So the idea here is we can think of the mind as embodying a hierarchy of different representational states. You have sort of low-level perceptual representations. Maybe at the lowest level, we perceive things like shapes and colors and edges. Then we have sort of higher-level visual perceptions of tables and chairs and so on and so forth, all the way up to highly sophisticated cognitive beliefs. Very abstract beliefs we have about mathematics or metaphysics or whatever. So we have this kind of hierarchy of representational states, and emotions sit somewhere in the middle. They are more abstract than perceptual states, but less abstract, less high level than cognitive attitudes like belief. And in particular, we can think of emotions as being what Peter Carruthers calls non-conceptual analog representations of value. So basically, an emotional state represents some situation in one's environment as good or bad for one to a given degree. So if one is sort of mildly afraid of something in one's environment, that's a distinctive way of representing that it's bad for you to, say, a small degree. If one has an intense fear of something in one's environment, that's a non-conceptual way of representing that something is bad for one to a great degree, and so on and so forth. And the idea here is these are genuine representational states. So again, we can think of fear as literally possessing the content, albeit in this kind of non-conceptual way, that the target is dangerous. And so, why might we want to think of emotions as these kinds of conscious representations of value? Well, there's some phenomenological evidence. When you are afraid of the bear that's rushing towards you, it seems like your fear is directed at the bear. There's also some neuroscientific evidence supporting this kind of picture. I'm not really going to get into that today. But the key idea here is these valenced experiences, these good or bad feeling emotional states, represent evaluative properties, evaluative features in the environment, and so they can misrepresent, not necessarily accurate. Okay, so I'll try to wrap up here quickly. So the key idea I want to get to try to explain emotional recalcitrance is emotions integrate two crucially different kinds of evaluative inputs. So emotions integrate both what we can call low-level, sort of perception-driven evaluative inputs, which are basic perception-driven appraisals of, objects and states of affairs in one's environment, which are rapid, automatic, and often unconscious assessments of, threats and promises and affordances that immediately surround one. But emotions also integrate higher level cognitive information. So beliefs, judgments, both these low level perceptual factors and high level cognitive factors are fed into what we can call the emotion system. And it's the balance between these two inputs that determines what emotion you feel, and the balance between these two forces can vary from one context to the next. So some emotional episodes are highly cognitively driven, others are highly perceptually driven. And so this is neither cognitivism nor perceptualism, nor some attempt to sort of marry the two. It's evaluativism. It's a distinctive way of thinking of what emotions are. So there's a grain of truth from both sides. Emotions are not judgments nor perceptions. They're evaluative states that draw on both perceptual and cognitive resources. Skip that. So to wrap up, emotions are a distinctive species of value representation. This explains their unique profile, neither pure judgment nor pure perception, but evaluative states with both motivating force and genuine correctness conditions. And it turns out that emotions are not a puzzling outlier in the mind, but in fact the manifestation of a ubiquitous feature of the way that the brain works. Turns out that these evaluative representations are part and parcel of the way that our brain operates. Skip all this because it's not super essential. Summarize. Okay. So to wrap up, what I've argued just now is emotions are evaluative representational states whose core evaluative output is valence, which is a non-conceptual representation of value or disvalue, so danger or beneficialness. Valence has correctness conditions. Emotions can represent or misrepresent the evaluative features of things in the environment. These value representations are both motivating and accuracy governed. And recalcitrant emotions are cases of valuational inaccuracy. So a recalcitrant emotion, like Spiros' fear of the dog, is essentially a case where Spiros' perception of the dog and its features gets heavily outweighed, basically outweighs the influence from his belief about the dog's danger, and causes Spiros to feel fear. And this perspective answers the grounding question, because the reason's responsiveness of emotions is grounded in the cognitive channel's capacity to modulate these emotional responses, and recalcitrance occurs when this modulation fails. Okay, so in this talk, I've argued that cognitivism and perceptualism face a dilemma: too much or too little rational conflict. I've argued that formal accounts like Misfit avoid this dilemma but face the grounding question. They restate rather than explain the phenomenon of emotional recalcitrance. So the grounding question is answered by reason's responsiveness. Emotions have rational status in virtue of being governed by processes that are causally coupled to the subject's perspective on their reasons. And I've given an empirically grounded sketch of an evaluativist model, which treats recalcitrant emotions as cases of valuational inaccuracy due to a discrepant signal strength of sort of low-level perception-driven inputs into the fear module. Okay, thank you.
Happy, as always, to establish a queue on your behalf. Just questions?
Sure.
And if student has said yes, you can begin.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. It is a very interesting talk. I think I'm very sympathetic with the move towards reasons responsiveness instead of the all or nothing and voluntary control.
Yep.
But in terms of speaking of recalcitrant emotion, I always have a question, and it's not only about your talk, but in general, is that when we say that, for example, you mentioned an example, if one says, I know the dog is not dangerous, but I am still afraid of it, and I think it is dangerous. So we think it is very irrational and weird to say that. But I think, isn't it the conflict of emotion? It's kind of a property of emotion itself.
Okay.
It's like we can say bittersweet or other things. Is like
Yes.
a parent is afraid of his son is going to college,
Good.
but he is still very happy that his son is a grown up and he can go to college.
Good.
So this is one of my questions.
Yeah. No. It's a great question. Yeah. I mean, tell me if this is helpful. So another respect in which emotions are different from beliefs is, it seems, if not psychologically impossible, at least very, like, well, how to put this? So there are these cases of emotional recalcitrance, but there are also cases, as you described, which don't seem irrational at all, where subjects nevertheless seem to have conflicting emotions. Yeah, bittersweet feelings. And I think the key to seeing what's going on there is, you can have different emotional responses to a given situation, and actually those emotional responses need not rationally conflict with one another. So, for example, in the case of, sending your child off to college, you're a parent, there's something both sad and, joyful about that circumstance. And there's no, I think, essential problem there, because, suppose we imagine that sort of each emotion in the mind is the processes that generated are relatively modular. So basically, there's a kind of module or something like a module in your brain that's picking up on sad features. And so, is it operating correctly when you send your kid off to college? Yes, because there's something sad about it. There's another sort of module in your brain that's tracking, is there something good happening? Is something good happening when you send your child off to college? Yes. So actually what's going on is both of these sorts of modules in the brain, the sadness module and the happiness module, are picking up on real features of the situation. And actually there's nothing logically contradictory about that. It is in fact fitting to feel happy and fitting to feel sad at the same time, in a case like, a parent sending their kid off to college or something like that. So why isn't there a logical contradiction there? Well, I guess to get into that, you need to say more about, or I would need to say more about the kinds of reasons responsiveness that emotions display. So I think the key to understanding the issue is, emotions are only responsive to a small set of reasons, right? So beliefs, because you can believe basically anything, anything that you can think can be a reason for a belief. But only a relatively small set of things can really be reasons for fear, or reasons for joy, or reasons for sadness, right? So I think the way of looking at it is, different emotions look at different aspects of a situation. And so, your your child going off to college is a sort of big situation. It has a sad aspect over here and a happy aspect over here. And each emotion is perfectly representing what it's trying to represent. And there's not really a logical contradiction there or any sort of real conflict, because each emotion is just doing exactly what it's trying to do. It's representing sadness is representing the sad features of the situation. Joy is representing the joyful features of the situation. And the situation actually has both. So that's how I distinguish that kind of situation from emotional recalcitrance. Is that? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your response.
We have another student question, perhaps? If not, I could open the floor to faculty as well. Nevia, go ahead.
Are you sure no students? Maybe later.
Sure, of course, yeah.
But Adam, thank you very much. This is for me an extremely interesting topic. And your presentation was very rich, so maybe now I hope that I did not, I'm not missing anything here. So I am one of those that think that perceptualist accounts of emotions are cognitivist accounts of emotions in disguise.
Okay.
And I find that, they share very fundamental similarities, like the fact that like the intentionalist component, the evaluative component, and so my question is, I'm a bit worried that those like me that have this kind of criticism towards perceptualism will also end up addressing the evaluative proposal in the same way.
Okay.
There is to me, something very striking that I find there, like, of course, the evaluative component of your proposal is necessarily bringing in some kind of propositional content in the emotional state.
Sure.
And so I really cannot make sense of like the quote that you presented from Karater's, maybe it's in the previous slide. I cannot make sense of the claim that such a state is non-conceptual.
Yeah.
Because it is clearly it is evaluative. There is this evaluative component that clearly brings in a propositional content.
Yep.
So how can we claim that is then non-conceptual? The math is space for concepts.
Good. No, great question. So this, reasons of space precluded me from getting into this. But I think there are good reasons for thinking that something like this picture is right that come from, for example, the emotions of non-human animals. So, of course, this is controversial, could be disputed, but it seems very plausible to me that, dogs and cats can feel fear. That seems pretty plausible. It seems less plausible to me. I can be convinced, but I don't think it's obvious that dogs and cats have conceptual capacities. And so there's a kind of argument there that emotions must not require conceptual capacities. It's possible to imagine some non-human animal that feels fear, and indeed feels, like if a dog gets attacked by a bear, seems like it's afraid of the bear. It's not a mystery what the dog's afraid of. So the dog's fear has intentionality. The dog's fear is a response to danger. Dogs are afraid of, bears and snakes, but they're not afraid of, food or, trees. Their fear seems to function like our fear, seems to have the same kind of target. So yeah, just very flat-footedly, it seems like non-human animals or pre-linguistic human beings can have emotional responses to things. Their emotional responses seem quite like our own, and it doesn't seem essential to those emotional responses that the creature has conceptual capacities. So that's I didn't argue that in the talk, but that's a kind of my background reason for thinking that emotion isn't essentially conceptual.
Right, so that would be like the case of pre-linguistic children or non-human animals would be like a counterexample for cognitivism, but even for perceptualism in a way.
Maybe,
Because yes. So my problem is that probably this is also a problem for this evaluative proposal, just because it still maintain and preserve a propositional content, just because it involves evaluations.
Yeah, I see the worry. Yeah, I think this gets into some deep water. There's a very, I think we start to get into methodological issues about sort of what we're doing when we're assigning propositional contents, or using propositional contents in sort of psychological or cognitive scientific explanations. So, for example, a very common paradigm in cognitive science, going all the way down, certainly to animals much simpler than human beings, is a kind of Bayesian paradigm. And in a Bayesian framework, you've got propositions, you've got credences, degrees of belief in technically every proposition that there is. So like if you're trying to model the behavior of a mouse, and getting through a maze and to develop a Bayesian model of that, you're attributing to the mouse, a certain degree of belief, certain credence that the exit to the maze is to the right rather than to the left, something like that. And yeah, you raise these issues like, does the mouse the mouse can't talk, does the mouse literally, have the belief that the exit to the maze is to the right? The mouse can't articulate that thought. So yeah, nevertheless, it's just very standard in cognitive science to attribute these kinds of representations. There are different things you can say to justify this. You can say they're idealizations. You can say that sort of, propositions are ways of sort of, measuring the mind. I mean, there's certain kinds of operationalizations of say credence in terms of like betting behavior. So you can just say like, ultimately what it is to say that the mouse, has a certain credence that P just is, 70% of the time it goes right in the maze, 30% of the time it goes left in the maze. That's just what it is for it to have, 70% credence that the exit in the maze is to the right. So yeah, there are lots to say about sort of justifying the use of sort of propositional language in cognitive science, in particular for sort of non-human animals or pre-linguistic humans. But I guess I'd say I think the practice is pretty well methodologically established, and so I don't feel too embarrassed by relying on it. Just in the sense that if it's no good to use propositions in our theorizing about representation, then we basically can't really talk about representation in cognitive science. I know some people think that, but that's, to me, that's a huge cost. Not being able to use propositional resources in theorizing about the mind.
There's students, perhaps. Okay. I could jump in first, perhaps.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Just like speculating on behalf of a cognitivist, I wonder if it does too much violence to the case study of someone like Spiros with Moby, to describe Spiros as not like bold-facedly hyper irrational in the sense of simultaneously, like apparently simultaneously judging that Moby is both dangerous and not dangerous, but that he's in this irrational state of like oscillating between the two judgments.
Okay, good. Yeah.
And like maybe just like a phenomenological reaction, like that just doesn't seem like what's going on with somebody like him. But I mean, I tend not to trust phenomenological
Fair.
reactions too much as a
Fair enough.
methodology. So like I would think like this is crude, but like what could be going on with somebody like Spiros is that he is, like the affective dimensions of the emotion are like triggering a fear judgment.
Yep.
But of course he maintains the sort of power to like divert his attention more to the reasons, which may then trigger the inverse judgment. And so it's not that he's like both judgments are never quite in mind at the exact same time slice, so to speak. And so he's maybe irrational because the oscillation is not stable, rationally speaking, but not too irrational, perhaps. So maybe that's the middle ground, and we don't need like a Goldilocks kind of state for that. We just need a more nuanced, like temporal picture of the judgments or something.
We don't need Goldilocks. We need a seesaw.
Right. Sure. Yeah. Well, right. Yeah.
Yes. No. That's interesting, and I think some the name escaped me at the moment, but I think some cognitivists have put forward more or less the strategy, or at least strategies that are similar. Because it's to be fair, it is a subtle thing whether because a lot of these sort of structural rational principles are strictly speaking synchronic, where they only apply at a time. And so if there's no single time at which but that cuts both ways. It's also true that if the principles are synchronic and there's no time at which he believes both the dog is dangerous and the dog is not dangerous, then it actually turns out that he's not irrational, which seems like the wrong result. So there's so the worry there is that you're going to get not flagrant irrationality only by getting no irrationality at all. But that's now we're on the other side of the Goldilocks thing. We've gone too far.
I guess I was hoping that there'd be some way you could accuse him of diachronic irrationality because the oscillation is like too severe or something. Not that too severe.
You could try that. I mean, I don't think that's not crazy. That you could that's the but even that.
I mean, that might not be any better than your picture in the end. It's just be space to look.
I mean, another thing in the vicinity that some people have proposed. I think I mentioned this briefly, but some people try to say what's going on isn't that Spiros both believes that the dog is dangerous and believes that the dog is not dangerous, but believes that the dog is not dangerous, but imagines that the dog is dangerous, something like that.
Yeah.
But those sorts of proposals then seem to face kind of Grzankowski's, the other part of the dilemma.
Yeah.
Imagine whatever you want. It doesn't. Sure. It's not rational. So I've never found those sorts of approaches too plausible. Shaw and Velleman have this paper, Doxastic Deliberation, where they talk about accepting a proposition.
Oh, sure.
And it basically where that's what's in common between believing the P, judging the P. If they say supposing the P, but I don't think that's quite right. But anyway, anything short of accepting a proposition, taking it to be true, isn't going to be good enough.
Okay. Oh, yeah, jump in and then we can go back to Nevia if no one else.
There is no time, no weekends.
That's true, yeah.
I had some difficulty with the kind of motivation for the problem with the dog because say if you take this kind of cognitive or understanding of emotion as something that is rational and is reason receptive, then It's seems very difficult to say that the dog is like not dangerous because the person is involved in what happened with the dog. So if I change to something like say fear of flying, right?
Yep.
And you might say that this is an irrational fear because it's unlikely that the plane crash will happen.
Good.
It's very different to say that it's irrational to believe that it's likely, and then that it's irrational to fear the plane crashing. Because although there's a very small chance that the plane will crash, if it does crash, then that will be something that is really like high stakes for me.
Yeah.
So there is no way rationally of weighing that small chance of it happening with the terribleness of me being involved in a plane crash.
Good.
So that makes it difficult. And then maybe if we transfer that to the situation of the dog, even though it's maybe not as high stakes, but if I really didn't want to be attacked by this golden retriever, although it's extremely unlikely that the golden retriever is going to attack me, it's difficult to say that the golden retriever is not dangerous.
Right. Good. Yeah. No, makes total sense. I mean, here's maybe not the exact same point, but a point I think very much in the vicinity. Maybe the exact same point. So you could say, like, look, cite all the statistics you want about, how often planes crash. It's dangerous to sit in a chair 30,000 feet in the sky. It is dangerous. If you fell out of the plane, you die. That's. So, there are different ways of understanding danger. Or like, if the danger of the dog is that it might bite you, well, it might bite you. There's no law of nature that says the dog can't bite. Maybe it wouldn't be, we could get into how bad it would be or whatever, but if danger is to some extent, I won't say subjective, but like, again, you might say, look, there are dangerous aspects of flying. You're really high up, and if you're really high up, you might fall. That's pretty, there's no mistake there. I didn't cite any statistics. That's just in flying, you're really high up. If you're really high up and you fall, you'll die. So, like, if in fear of flying, you're just sensitive to those facts, then what's irrational about it? Or likewise, if dogs have teeth, they can bite you with their teeth. So what you're afraid of is the dog biting you, or the possibility of the dog biting you. That's a real thing. Is that a
Like there's fair be some kind of relationship between the probability of something happening and the extent to which I don't want it to happen, and it's very difficult to turn that into the kind of fact that it's true or false.
Well, okay, good, but here's where I push back. So another thing it sounded like you were saying in your question was, basically you could make it out to be rational if you set the probability a certain way and the negative, or the expected value a certain way. And the answer to that surely is that's correct. If someone if someone assigns negative infinity value to getting bit by Moby, then they should not be anywhere near the dog, because no matter how safe the dog is, he still could bite you. It's not a law of nature that Moby can't bite. So there is a way of making the fear rational. The problem is, in cases of emotional recalcitrance, it's the subject himself or herself who thinks that it's irrational. So the point there would be, I think you're imagining not Spiros, but a different subject. The sort of the rational dog fearer. The rational dog fearer is just someone who says, look, I know that the fear of being bit by this dog is very low. I just assign it such disvalue that it makes sense for me to be afraid. And then what I would say is that's perfectly possible. Someone like that could exist. But then that's not a recalcitrant emotion. It's only recalcitrant if by your lights you think to yourself, why am I afraid of this dog? He's not going to attack me. And so my claim is just that happens sometimes too. So even if in many cases, like this, there's no irrationality. Still, in some cases, which I think probably all of us have experienced to some degree or other, you experience an emotion and by your own lights, like, what am I afraid of? I know this is perfectly safe. You know, why am I angry at Ben? He didn't do anything to me.
I probably did.
But here I am. I'm angry. You know, so you can feel the rational tension yourself. It's not just sort of imposed from you by external standards. In many cases, the subject is just as aware as anyone else. This is irrational. I shouldn't be afraid of this. Nice little dog.
Well, that brings us to an end for today. Could we thank our speaker one more time? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I should also mention an unfortunate correction must be made. The email that you might have received about this event indicated that we would have a reception downstairs at the Port Club.
We do not.
Thanks for the question.